Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from and whatever time of day it is where you are located, we thank you for taking time to join us for this webinar today. My name is Kenza Gunter, and I currently serve as the president of ASP. And again, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. As you know, we are today going to be talking about global diversity within the world of sport and performance, and the link between culture and mental health. And in fact, this is a joint adventure between ASP and BASES in an effort to bring forth various perspectives to really have a discussion, a global discussion about the ways in which there is a link between mental health and why that is important for us to discuss within the world of sport. We have a fantastic slate of panelists who will be responding to questions that have been pre-submitted. And also there will be an opportunity for you all to submit questions live. If you have questions that you would like to submit, please use the Q&A function as a part of this webinar. Additionally, just two other things for me to let you all know. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available probably within a week or so after the conclusion of the event. Additionally, we will be sending an evaluation that you can expect to receive about 3 or 4 hours after the conclusion of the webinar as well. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's moderator, who will share a bit with you all about whom she is, and then we'll introduce the rest of our fantastic panelists. And so Dr. Kotryna Fraser, who is stationed at the University of Newcastle in Australia, is our moderator for today. And at this point, I will turn it over to her to share again more with you about whom she is, and then she will introduce our panelists. Again, thank you all, and we hope that you enjoy the event.
Thank you, Kenza. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, regardless where you're based. Thank you for joining in to our first joint webinar. And on behalf of BASES, I would like to thank all the panelists to begin with for dedicating your time and knowledge, and ask for, I guess, agreeing for this joint adventure. My name is Dr. Kotryna Fraser, and I am an associate lecturer at the University of Newcastle in Australia. I currently serve as a chair of BASES Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group. My research interests are along those lines as well. I'm currently investigating stereotypes and effect different types of stereotypes have on performance, not only athletes' performance, but also support staff worldwide. Without further ado, I'm just gonna go in respect to geographic location closest to myself, which is Hong Kong. And I would like to introduce Karen Law, who is the Vice President of the Hong Kong Society of Sport and Exercise Psychology. She also sits on the Athletic Performance Enhancement Subcommittee of the Hong Kong Paralympic Committee Sports Association for the physically disabled. So she brings a wealth of knowledge, not only from Asia and this part of the world, but also in respect of different constructs athletes are faced with. Karen is a practitioner, has a wealth and breadth of experience working with school, collegiate athletes, as well as Olympic athletes, not only in Hong Kong and Asia, as well as in Canada and US. Let's go over to London in England, and without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Paul Gorczynski, who is a public and mental health researcher at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. From what I know, Paul's most current work calls for a more equal health model addressing chronic conditions, mental health, and public health interventions among LGBTQAI+ community. Paul was one of the expert panel members for the iOS consensus statement on mental health in elite athletes. So he's going to bring a lot of knowledge and insider knowledge about mental health in elite athletes, as well as slightly different populations. And lastly, Professor Margaret Ottley, who is currently based in Oregon, in the United States. It's very early hours in the morning for Professor Ottley, and I do hope you've got lots of caffeine in front of you. She has a wealth of experience, practice, as well as research, and her current research interests are in racial and social justice and Capoeira Angola at Western Chester University in Pennsylvania. She is an applied practitioner and has a great breadth and depth of experiences working with different athletes across multiple sports, not only in US, but also in Trinidad and Tobago. So she's gonna bring a slightly more Caribbean, I guess, perspective to today's discussion, as well as a slightly, I guess, diverse perspectives more than anything. So that's us, the panelists on today's discussion. And let me start with our very first question, which is as follows. More and more athletes, coaches, and others in the sport community are sharing their stories about mental health and talking about overall well-being. However, mental health is viewed differently in different parts of the world. Can you all share your thoughts about connection between mental health and cultural diversity and how all this relates to performance? Karen, would you be so kind to open our discussion this morning, evening?
Sure, I will certainly start sharing about how mental health is viewed in this part of the world where I'm from. I'm from Hong Kong. To be honest, people here in Hong Kong tend to have a very generic term for health professionals. So whether you are a doctor, a psychiatrist, a counselor, psychologist, we all call them doctors in our own language. So in Cantonese, you just basically call them doctors. So obviously when you call them doctors, you have a visual image of someone in, a white lab coat. And so when it comes to mental health, then it's basically the doctor that treats, the crazy people. And so when I was working with athletes, they certainly saw me as the doctor for the team. And there's a stark difference. So, I could give you an example of a basketball team that I've previously worked with. There are local players as well as imports, and the imports could be from Australia, Canada, Europe, etc. And it's very different on how they view me and my role as well. And so they would, if the local players see me, they would say, okay, Karen, they would start becoming defensive and say, Karen, is there something coach told you about me? Versus, an import who might just say, well, Karen's here because she wants us to be the best version of ourselves. So they're more accepting that way. So as you can see, there's a big difference between two different populations.
So should I just jump in?
Yeah, please, Margaret.
Yeah, so my introduction to this whole concept on mental health and performance is really personal. Like many psychologists and counselors, it's a lot of me search. As an elite athlete, I played field hockey for Trinidad and Tobago for over 12 years at all the developmental levels. And for me, it was, on what we call a small island mentality, where we would play really inside of the region, the Caribbean region, and even within our own countries, we'll compete with such force and drive. And, winning was so important from a cultural perspective, how we were raised. But what I noticed is that when we came up against, countries like Wales and Scotland or the US, we will crumble. And I wanted to understand that a little closer because losing shifted from being this external process, like, okay, we lost this game and let's go on to the next one and we're going to play hard. But it became more internal to me, where I was feeling despondent and I was feeling like I plateaued and there was no way to get, to that other level to compete on a global stage. So inside of my research, I could recognize, or I started looking through the lenses of Caribbean worldview, and which is influenced by a very Africanist worldview, and discovered that in ancient African languages that there was no word for psychology. Which means that we really depended on direction from our elders. Ancestrism was really important, what it was passed down through the generations, good and the bad. It influenced our attitudes and our behaviors. So for me, this is personal. I'm always trying to navigate and try to find how best I can help athletes move from one level to the other, from the mental perspective, and to not be stuck inside of the terminology small island mentality, because we are huge, we are musical, we love to dance, we have given the world steel pan and calypso and soca music and the region, reggae and dancehall, so we are a musical country. And so I embraced that, studied Capoeira Angola for many years, and started looking at writers from the British writers who were saying that Caribbean athletes changed the form of English soccer. So this is where my interest is in terms of embracing who we are and our culture as a power source to face the world.
Thank you very much, Margaret. It's truly a very different perspective in comparison to Hong Kong and the rest of the world. And you just make me want to dance now, especially hearing about all the soccer music.
Oh, yeah.
Let us move on and talking a little bit more about different identities which intersect in sport. So when speaking about culture, we often focus on racial, ethnic identity, and gender. What are some of the other cultural factors and identities that we should be mindful of? Paul, do you mind opening this question for me, please?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a real treat to be here and to actually talk about something that is profoundly important. And I think that's where I want to start is to kind of think about what are we actually talking about with respect to sport, and also what are we actually talking about with respect to mental health. And it's important to get a diverse amount of perspectives, different thoughts on this. And so when we're talking about sport, are we talking about recreation? Are we talking about elite levels of sport? Are we talking about folks who are engaged in some sort of community level of sport? I guess what's the frame in terms of what we're really focused on? And the same really goes for mental health. The two previous speakers, you heard diverse perspectives towards mental health in different parts of the world. And it's important to think about the multiple aspects that are often talked about when mental health comes up. And so there are elements of thriving, of individuals flourishing, of recognizing various abilities, individuals being able to contribute to communities, being able to perform their best. It's individuals also being able to cope with various challenges in their lives. And there's all sorts of kind of eudaimonic and hedonic factors involved with mental health. There's elements of purpose, and there's also elements of pleasure that are involved in this kind of exploration. And all of this is largely dependent on our cultural perspectives, our shared values, our particular beliefs, our various attitudes about various aspects of sport, about various aspects elements of sport, of who gets to play and who doesn't, and also our perspectives towards mental health. There has to be room for a variety of different perspectives and areas to apply this kind of knowledge. When we're thinking about the diversity, all this kind of aspects of diversity, it's important to think about elements of our own practice and our own research and reflect on what we actually do. What kinds of elements of reflection do we undertake? How do we actually think about what we're doing, who we're engaging with, and why are we engaging in that particular aspect and what we're trying to help? One particular area that individuals may wish to focus in on, and when we're speaking about the diversity of individuals involved, are some of the protected characteristics that exist in various aspects around the world. And so when we're thinking about it, say through a British lens, it's protected through various levels of legislation. So we're thinking about aspects of age, of disability, of gender identity, of sex, of maternity, of individuals who are pregnant, of course, race and ethnicity, but there's also elements of spirituality, religion, and sexuality. And so when we're thinking about all these kinds of different aspects of culture, of what else to think about in people's identities, there's a lot to think about. And it's a matter of how we reflect on our practice and our research, of how far we want to go and explore certain aspects of various identities in various aspects of sport, with various perspectives towards mental health and what the ultimate goals are.
Thank you, Paul. You're making some excellent points over here. So let me just perhaps take over from you and just add, so what are the other identities we might be coming across, sometimes mindfully, sometimes not that mindfully by chance? And I guess for me, I'm not a native speaker. And, I did all my education and training in the UK. I'm from Eastern Europe. And the challenge I always faced with was I'm not a native speaker. So I may look like that I belong because the color of my skin. But the second I start talking, the accent puts me into a different box. This is where you come from. And now, coupled with stereotypes, the country or the region also where I come from, so you must be Polish. I'm not Polish. So if you have a similar accent, you come from Eastern Europe, in the UK, therefore you must be from this country because we've got lots of migrant workers from that country. Are you here to work on the farms? So that's stereotypes which come with that, simply based on assumptions made by the language or the accent I carry. So it doesn't have to be whether it's your native language or not native language. It can be, right? So if you come from Scotland, most likely you have very strong Scottish accent. Now, in comparison to someone who comes from England. So they have slightly different or very traditionally British accent. Now talk to someone who is in US. We might use, or we may want to say the same things, and yet we use slightly different vocabulary to say the same things, and suddenly we can't understand each other, but we talk the same language, right? So the dialects, geographically where we are, how we belong. Then on top of that, we also need to think about people who are second generation. So people whose parents immigrated and started a new life somewhere else, had children, so they're native-born children to foreign parents. So what about their identities? At home, they're taught to be so-and-so, right? So at home, you might be raised as a Chinese, you might be raised as a Polish person, you might be raised as a American person. Outside, you are meant to fit in into the environment and culture and society. You perhaps feel you belong more so in comparison to your parents' culture. So you've got those two different cultures happening within your worlds, and who are you? So how do we deal with those athletes? What type of culture you are bringing when talking to them? How you're addressing this conflict, internal conflict we deal day in, day out. And then on top of that, we've got people, Karen, you mentioned at the beginning, so you've got people who are native in that country versus those who immigrate to play sport, right? Imports. So what about them? How do they adjust to the culture they're in? And how do we accept them who are imports in our own teams? And then carry on. So we've got people from different backgrounds, different socioeconomic classes. So you don't have to be from different country or different culture. Is this mainstream understanding of culture? You can be from different neighborhood, which introduces very, very different challenges, different access to facilities. So how do we work with those people? Do we talk their language? Do we talk, the culture they understand? How do we fit in with them? How do they fit in with us? And then I guess one of other examples which I really like giving to my students, sport itself has a culture, right? So if you play, and cricket is probably my favorite example in this occasion, because if you go to the UK and play cricket, you are very posh from very well-known family, probably very well-off family, because you can afford to play cricket. Cricket is perceived to be a sport of elites. Unless you go to Yorkshire, isn't it? I think it's Yorkshire where cricket is perceived slightly differently. But then go to Caribbean countries, right? Margaret, and correct me if I'm wrong, cricket is street sport over. Everyone plays cricket, right? You just take something, anything you can to bat, and you bat it on the streets. Australia, it's exactly the same. You play cricket in the backyard. You play cricket on the beach. I left work the other day. I saw some students playing cricket in the car park at night. So playing cricket doesn't really tell you much. You're definitely not from posh background. So we need to think about sports culture. We need to think about that sports culture in a different country. And then even if it's the same country and the same sport, how does that culture differ from one club to another club? So I guess these are very different and very subtle identities we have to think about when we're working with different athletes, but also with different practitioners, because we've got so many people forming support networks, forming our colleagues, our fellow colleagues around the athletes. So we work and interact with different people. It doesn't have to be our clients all the time, our fellow colleagues. So really have to be mindful and really reflect and engage in that reflection. Paul has spoken about how to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve while maintaining, I guess, while being mindful of other people's boundaries and optimal performance. So I'm going to finish off here. We have quite a different ways to take this conversation further. But the next question I would like to ask is this: how does culture intersect with sport and performance, and why should we as practitioners be aware of those intersections? Margaret, do you mind jumping in and taking your question for me, please?
Oh, yes, sure. It's a great discussion. Especially, you're coming from such a diverse background and how wide it is and how many different subsets we have within culture itself. But culture, you're right, culture is really, it belongs to the people. So we collectively, in whatever geographical location, we shape our own culture. And I'm glad that you brought up cricket, because our writers, from way back that influenced us, like C.L.R. James, talked about cricket in order to explain our behaviors and attitudes. And it was played by the elite. It was introduced to our region. It's the only sport presently that we play collectively and represent the world collectively as the West Indies team, which has always been a powerhouse, and it gave us presence in the world. So it became a part of our culture, because sport generally within the Caribbean region, it wasn't emphasized as the most important thing to give us upward mobility, economic mobility. We were taught that education was really what it is. Our future was really in our school bags and not sport. Sport was something that you do, but to make a living from sport was different. So we know that in the region, for us as a people, having a history of slavery and survival and or being slighted and disadvantaged, and all of the words that we are using presently, cricket and education and religion were not given to us to enlighten us. It was really given us to us to be disciplined subjects and of the crown, as we would put it. So it's really interesting how we have embraced cricket by watching the elites play, and we did play it in our backyards, and we played it on the beaches. And then we learned to play it because we were preparing, the people were preparing the fields and doing the more menial work. So we understood it from a different perspective. And as we play what we would call bat and ball, and we play with anything, we can turn anything into a ball, and a coconut branch as a bat, we would play. We became stronger and better, and we rejoiced as a nation or as a region when we would beat England, because of course England was our colonizers, one of. We did have the French and the Spaniards as well. So so culture is for us, it is a part of our what makes sense in the world. I talked earlier about the small island mentality. Our culture, I started looking a little closer on the comfort zone. When I first joined ASP, I was presenting quite a lot on and challenging our concept of the comfort zone. When people would say, we as practitioners, we would say, get out of your comfort zone. And I was saying, wait, hold on, let us re-examine this comfort zone, because we lose it when we get out of it and we can't perform and we try to be like someone else, and we lose our rhythm. And it's very similar that it was depicted in that movie Cool Runnings that everybody seemed to love, with the Jamaican bobsled team, right? It's Jamaica we come from. We talk Jamaican, we walk Jamaican, right? So that is how we, the comfort zone was important, because inside of the comfort zone were the voices of our elders that were reminding us that we are relevant. Inside of the comfort zone, we had our education, and we turn it into something else, that we can become some of the greatest writers, that influence the world's thoughts. So it is connected, our foods are well celebrated, because we are collectively Indians and Africans and Chinese, and we are one of the most cosmopolitan regions in the world. And we live together in a certain harmony. So it was important, our comfort zone was important. And when I work with athletes and I see them at the Olympics and they work so hard, and yet, we look at other countries and we look at how they are dressed and they have everything that, the best equipment, the best training, technology to train with, and beautiful stadiums. We don't, I look at them and I see them make the comparison and sink back into themselves. And then it's always reminding them, hey, remember where you came from. Remember how powerful, you don't have to, come out there and say, that with a certain attitude, like, yeah, we're relevant. We are always relevant. We survived a whole lot of illness, and some of the harshest mental traumas that in history, and our people have survived, and we are here, right? So that is the attitude of shifting the dialogue from small island mentality to, hey, we are here because we were supposed to be here, and we will compete. Yeah.
Thank you, Margaret. Karen, would you be able to take over for me?
Sure. I really like Cool Runnings, by the way. So thank you, Margaret, for bringing that up. I really love that movie. Anyway, yeah, so I guess just to give everyone a little bit more context about what Hong Kong is like. We also used to be a British colony until 1997, where we were handed back over to China, but we would still have our own government and our own legislation and currency and all that. So it's a place, it's a metropolitan area where East meets West. And however, what I also see is even though we were colonized by the British a long time ago, our Chinese roots are still very strong. And so, you know, we would, although we call we would call ourselves, you know, Hong Kong Chinese, we're very Chinese, and we would follow a lot of Chinese customs and traditions. And the way I view this question is, you know, just looking to see a little bit more about the Hong Kong, I guess, sport culture, or Hong Kong culture in general, in terms of how, you know, what sort of shared values or beliefs that we have. There's a famous Cantonese saying over the past decade that has become like a popular phrase amongst parents and amongst coaches, is to win at the start line. So that roughly translates to having an advantage over other people early. And this could apply to education, this could apply to sport, to music. So as long as we become serious about, you know, whatever you're immersed in, like whether it's, you know, playing the violin or, you know, playing soccer or playing basketball, you have to do it well. And the reason for doing well is because you want to get into a good school and you want to get ultimately to get a good job. And so what I see is parents tend to show very little interest in the children's viewpoints regarding family matters, or, you know, the emphasis is more on the adherence to having like correct values. It's about being polite and respecting our elderly, and you know what they see is the most important. And so if we look at that in terms of sport, we are doing sport that is for something else. So it's more of like an intrinsically motivated thing to do, because ultimately we're not thinking of turning pro. We're doing sport and we want to do it well because we wanted to get into an Ivy League university, for example. And so I guess knowing and being a little bit more aware of this culture and context could really help practitioners in making informed decisions and thinking about what interventions to do with either the athlete or the client. So I think going back to, you know, just understanding the context, as practitioners, we always tend to, you know, ask who's the client. And I think just by asking this question, it also includes understanding the background of the client and where they're coming from, and how strongly, I think one of you did mention this earlier, how strongly does the athlete or does the client we work with identify with such values or beliefs? Like, do they think that they should be adhering to these Chinese traditional shared values or beliefs, or do they think, or does the family, or is the family more open and more westernized, so to speak? So I think it's very important as practitioners to understand the context as well as the culture before they make informed decisions or of what the intervention could look like.
Excellent tips and advice. Thank you both for sharing this today. And Margaret, you mentioned spirituality and religion a number of times, and it's important, especially in Caribbean countries and Caribbean region. So my next question to the panelists is as follows. Discuss how spirituality, religion, and wellness components affect performance and health. Margaret, would you be able to kick this off for me, please?
Yeah, yes, it's so inherent, you know, in our day-to-day life. It's not just something that we do. And I know it was brought to us in a certain form in the Caribbean through like Catholicism. But you know, one of the things that we still struggle with is our African-based spirituality, and which is very similar to our First Nation people, our Native Indians. It's very similar to what a lot of things that we are talking about now, like mindfulness and that self-awareness and being in the present. So for me, looking at Capoeira Angola was an in and really understanding because of all of the stigma. We see movies for generations on Voodoo, for example, and it's always in this dismal way, and there's a innate feeling that everything that came out of Africa was to be dismissed and forgotten. But there seemed to be a resurgence of accepting our ancestrism, as we saw in the Black Panther movie, why people embraced it so much, because it gave a certain kind of pride. But there's actual research that is now showing the change of the cerebral cortex in the brains and the certain hormones that that the brain functions better with, or it reacts, I should say, to meditation and getting inside of that wider self that we call the spiritual self. So for me, it's looking at athletes inside of, I love Brazilian culture, because Capoeira has shaped me. And looking at Pelé's work, I've been studying his work for ages, and look at all the movement. And we talk about the bicycle kick, and I say, hey, listen, that's a capoeira move right there, right? Just the whole rhythm and the samba and how it's played inside of our sense of self. It opens a new dimension, new portals, a new connection to something that is higher than what we can see. So I ask athletes, I say, if you don't believe in something that is, in God, if you don't believe, if you don't have, at least think of yourself maybe standing beside an ocean. And so you can see how that we're it's like a humble, it makes us humble. It makes us know that there is a presence out there that we need to tap into. And our Caribbean people have always been to, there's no, going to a counselor is really not something that we naturally leaders. We will go to for the advice of or do some ritual that maybe would open up a space. So I love the whole concept of religion. Inside of my work, I like energies. I practice Reiki to help my athletes, become more skilled, more still, and be able to just open up a new dimension. So this is a big topic for me, and so I can be pulling from everywhere inside of the culture and inside of spirituality, as we know. But to me, it's just one space that is beyond the body, beyond the sea, what you can see.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for your very interesting perspectives. Paul, what about you? What is your opinion and experience when it comes to spirituality and sport and performance?
I think I have a very complicated history with religion. As someone who immigrated from Poland with his mother to Canada in the mid-'80s, religion played a very important part in settling in Canada, in getting to know individuals and in making communities. And through that, also an exposure to sport, sport through church and sport as part of church. And so, but it's also, and as a gay man, I have a very difficult time reconciling myself with Catholicism. And I think also as a Canadian, there's this now difficulty of Catholicism with what's happening with residential schools, for instance. So there's a great deal of conflict that I feel personally toward my religion and my upbringing in that respect. But I think there's so much importance to think about with respect to religion, how it can bring comfort to people, how it is a place of community, how it does bring people together, how it can center individuals, how it can be a place to turn to in times of crisis. And I think that's really important to recognize those kinds of benefits and those kinds of values that through spirituality and religion, they can do for entire communities. And I think it's also just important to reflect on that. And again, I mentioned reflection earlier, but it's a great deal of having to work with individuals and see where religion, spirituality works within our clients. I think it's also important to see how we approach religion in our research. Do we talk about it actively with participants? Do we structure studies to explore religion and how there might be connections between spirituality, religion, and mental health? Do we talk about it with our clients? Or is this something of a topic that we do not wish to discuss at all? And I think that being uncomfortable with religion or being uncomfortable with spirituality really limits the kind of therapeutic relationship that you can develop with a client. And I think it really limits the kind of research that we can do. And if you really think about it, it can become a bit of a slippery slope. That if we're unwilling to talk and deal with spirituality and unwilling to talk about elements of religion, what else are we unwilling to talk about or explore in our research? Are we unwilling and unlikely to discuss aspects of, say, gender identity? Are we unwilling and not likely to talk about aspects of sexuality? Do we not talk about elements of race, ethnicity? Where do we draw the line? And I think that as researchers, as practitioners, it really does come back to reflection. And how do we even view diversity? How do we view inclusion? How do we work with all sorts of individuals and also recognize our own blind spot? What are our own challenges? How do we learn to live with them, to work with them, to work with others? How do we push ourselves? So I think this is a great question because I think it's a really interesting opportunity to develop some deep relationships with the people we work with and the people that we may be conducting studies with to help them. But it's such an important element of culture to understand where people come from religious perspectives and spiritual perspectives, because that in itself may be such an important vehicle to healing and to recovery. So there's so much that you can unpack with this question, and that it is always worth thinking about and perhaps bringing up with clients or even thinking about in the midst of research.
Thank you, Paul. And I guess just to follow up a little bit on some of the points you just mentioned, how does the religion may affect athletes' performance and mental health, or us, the practitioners, not being comfortable to explore that space, what effects that may have on our clients? Do you have any ideas, any thoughts on that?
I think the most important. Go ahead, Margaret.
Now I was going to respond to something that you said. Which it's just who we are. I was looking at the U.S. trials that just finished, and track and field in particular, and I was listening to the interviews after they earn a spot in the Olympics, on the Olympic team. And almost every athlete, gave up thanks to, I want to thank God. I was thinking as I was listening to these young athletes just celebrate this difficult topic, as Paul indicated, they were so boldly talking about it and how it impacted where they are and this journey that they're about to take. So I thought about COVID, and I thought about all of the social injustice issues that they were going through collectively, all of the loss, that we have had. I thought about, I heard, some of the athletes talk about their grandparents, and I started thinking, these generations who are preparing the children, and I didn't realize that 500,000 grandparents within the African American communities, actually raising these athletes. We saw an athlete run up to the stands and hug her grandmother. Those are some of the things that, as practitioners, if we don't, come through, understand these worldviews, or the client's worldview, how can we really help? So I just wanted to add that to what Paul was saying. It's profound.
Thank you, Margaret. Paul, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's great. I think it helps to get to know the people you're working with. Ultimately, you want to have a good understanding of who it is that you're working with, and perhaps how best you can help, and understanding where people are with respect to religion, with respect to their spirituality, may be an important part of their overall recovery, or how they build community, or how they actually perhaps exist outside of sport. And also, this is something that perhaps may bring them comfort. So if you have athletes who are experiencing various mental health symptoms and disorders, they might come see you with respect to elements of your performance. But where else may they turn to with respect to mental health symptoms and disorders? And individuals might not be particularly comfortable with dealing with various practitioners, whether they be psychiatrists or psychologists, for particular clinical purposes. Psychotherapists, social workers, I mean, the list can go on. They may seek comfort in other areas. So this might include individuals who are in their church or their temple or their mosque, or whatever aspect that may relate to their religious traditions. It's also, I think, important to think about how individuals will use that opportunity to connect. I mean, one of the things that we've seen a lot of athletes and a lot of people in general deal with, especially with respect to COVID, is loneliness and feeling disconnected, and potentially looking toward faith, spirituality, religion. This may actually bring people together. So I think it does impact an athlete. It does provide other avenues for potential health promotion, for building community, which ultimately will start to have an impact on their performance.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, I guess, follow up with another question over here. Paul, you mentioned different symptoms of mental health issues among different populations, people from different cultures. So the question is as follows. Understanding the differences between various cultures in manifesting symptoms of mental health problems, for example, somatic versus psychological symptoms of depression in China versus North America, and in responding to different mental health support strategies, for example, explicit versus implicit social work in Western versus Asian cultures. Any advice on how to create a common ground in supporting the mental health of a highly international team?
Of an international team. I think this is actually one of the most important aspects, is to think about the kind of therapeutic relationships that you develop with your clients, and also how you get to know individuals. And working from an element of diversity, understanding different cultural aspects from different elements, from different cultures, all helps in develop a particular therapeutic alliance where individuals start to feel they can trust you. Now, it's also important to recognize within this that as a sports and exercise psychologist, I can only work within certain boundaries. So for instance, I have to be mindful of my competencies, for instance. So I can't start dealing with issues of diagnosis or even issues of treatment, and I will have to refer those. But speaking from a perspective of just performance, it's about building trust, about building relationships, getting to know individuals, getting to know entire teams, and also being an individual who can be a conduit to other support services. So without that kind of trust, without that therapeutic alliance, individuals will not feel so inclined as to perhaps listen or seek advice as to where they may turn to for advice. And so this might, unfortunately, if that's not the case of developing a strong therapeutic relationship, what may actually emerge is more of a disconnect and an inability perhaps to seek support elsewhere. And more importantly than anything, as a sport and exercise psychologist, one of the most important things you can do is provide knowledge around mental health. You can help establish a particular culture around it, so you can combat public stigma that will impact, of course, self-stigma, and you can help individuals seek support. If anything, as sports and exercise psychologists working within our competencies, we can help individuals seek the kind of support that they're comfortable with. More than anything, developing a therapeutic relationship will help not only knowledge traverse across boundaries, cultural boundaries, but also make it okay to think about mental health differently and how we might go about seeking support.
Thank you very much, Paul. Karen, Margaret, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I had the opportunity to actually work, through clinical mental health, student athletes, and I realized that some of the things that what I was hearing, I'm very practical, so a lot of my what I'm sharing is also always coming from some kind of usable or user-friendly perspective. This athlete, her concern is Asian. Her concern was really the challenges that she faced, as a tennis player, and it was all from a cultural perspective, and this need to succeed, and to be in the best, and it's not naturally my culture. So as a practitioner, my goal was really to listen and to hear the narrative, to hear where she was coming from, to understand the dynamics within the family structure. And I think we so often as therapists, we so often want to help that we get caught up inside of our own worldview, and not understand that the athlete is coming from somewhere else, and we need to be educated. But and I say that in because it's not a matter of saying, well, tell me about, educate me about, because that's not the role of the client. But listening really is extremely important, and understanding what drives this person, and what this person really is, what they care about. And that is the opening space in the therapeutic relationship where the dialogue can take place. So for me, it's really, I love cultural perspectives. I understand my own difference, and how invisible I can feel, and I like creating that space for athletes of diverse to just talk about.
So I guess when talking about different symptoms of mental health and, so how do we deal with that within very international teams? One thing I guess to think about is it's going back to all those different points, or maybe similar points every single of you have made already. It's really understanding where that person, your client, is coming from, what culture they're coming from, and where that potential anxiety may come from, what it is associated with. So as Karen mentioned earlier on, is it the culture where you expect it to perform at high standards from day one? So you're starting, before you come to the start line, isn't it? So you're really putting all the resources over. So anxiety comes from the family, from cultural expectation. So how do you deal with a client like this, right? When talking about, so some of my colleagues have done excellent work with men and mental health in men. And one of the interesting findings is that actually the mental health issues across different sexes are different. So we shouldn't be, using scales which might be based on symptoms shown by females to diagnose males. So how do you deal with that as well? Are they all universal? So really need to take into consideration all those differences. And how do we establish common ground? The honest question is, I don't know, but probably it's all about talking to begin with, right? So challenging stigma, Karen, you spoke about at the very beginning of our discussion. So how do we challenge the stigma? How do we raise awareness? How do we say that, one might feel anxious and be physically sick in comparison to someone else who might experience slightly different types or symptoms of anxiety, and much more to do with self-isolation, with self-doubt, negative thinking, and so on. So really perhaps raising awareness more than anything. Whilst talking about stigma, there was a question I would like to ask Karen. So Karen, how would you fight the doctor stigma you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion with local athletes in Hong Kong, and how were these athletes' perspective about seeking help for mental health?
Right, thank you. I think I'm reading the right question as you were speaking. I think it was a question about how I deal with the doctor stigma, right? Yeah. So thank you so much for the question. To be honest, it's really about educating the public about the differences between a doctor, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a counselor. And it's also, whenever I'm working with teams, I also try and make sure that I'm very cautious about how people view my role. And whether it's about, first of all, educating maybe the coaches first, or maybe the senior management team first, before it sort of trickles down to the athletes. Or it's about maybe the way I physically interact with the athletes. So is it because, I put on a too serious face, not saying that my role isn't serious, but maybe it's because they see me as, someone who is here to fix issues, for example. Do I come across as that way? So, as my years of being a practitioner and working with individual athletes and clients, I'm very, cautious and careful, and I do tread carefully, and I evaluate myself from time to time to see, if there are differences as I work with different athletes or teams, and being mindful of that as well. So I guess it boils down to both education and as well as the way I interact with the athletes ultimately.
Thank you very much. You mentioned coaches. So as a question about coaches, so for anyone, feel free to take it. So most of high performance clients work with coaches of cultural backgrounds different from us, and that impacts their performance. Coach cultural background impacts have been positive where the approach was blended, as opposed to those where the athletes were expected to shift from that typical culture and own mentality or comfort zone. I would like to hear any experiences from any of you. Thank you.
I guess I could try. Now, I think I'm reading this question correctly. And so the coach comes from a different cultural background, and I think the answer is to see if we've had any experiences working with someone like that, and when the coach has a different cultural background to the athletes or the teams, correct? Right. So yeah. So I mean, I do come across teams from time to time where coaches are from the US or from Western countries, and they do struggle sometimes with keeping our athletes motivated, our local athletes motivated. So if we look at, for example, I'm sure that, if the coach does try and implement, motivational techniques, whether it's, self-determination theory or whatnot, they do struggle sometimes with autonomy, for example, because in the Chinese context, autonomy would be, I guess, roughly translated to something that is out of control. Like, oh, you're giving too much, choice to the athletes, for example. So I guess I could, as I'm working with the coach, it's about defining what autonomy could mean perhaps in the Chinese context, or what competence could mean in the Chinese context, or what relatedness could mean in the Chinese context. So is it about giving the athletes choices instead of letting them do whatever they want? Or should we maybe in the Chinese context focus a little bit more on relatedness and competence instead of autonomy? So I guess it's about also speaking with the coaches, communicating with them closely, and also talking a little bit more about the context and the culture and the upbringing that we're in, and seeing if we can find a middle ground. So I guess that's my perspective on the question.
That's a great point, Karen. One of my favorite theories. I love when theory comes up and shows up in practice. In terms of self-determination theory, from the Caribbean perspective, it would be similar. It's really interesting that you put, and I'm thinking that's my Caribbean athletes as well. It's my African American athletes. So relatedness is extremely important in terms of how we interact and how we receive them, because it's so. If you can't build that trust relationship, then there's an issue. And I know a lot of coaches really don't like, or some sports psychologists would say, well, coaches don't like working with us. Yeah, and part of it is really, because they may feel that we are stepping inside because athletes would, talk about them. So now we hold this information that they are not privy, of hearing. But I really think there's a certain kind of openness and inside of the relationship, because athletes value that trust, and also in terms of autonomy, they want to be a part of the process. A lot of times we make goals for the athletes, and we tell them what, because we're so, as coaches, we're so regimented, and we know exactly how to get them from here to there, and it's a lot of discipline it takes. But inside of all of that, the creative mind as a coach is important. And how do you sell this package to the athlete and make the athlete a part of the process? And I just looking at the chat, I'm seeing a lot of the people who mentored me are in there, and those are things that I learned, as coming up as a young sports psychologist, inside of the field, and now switching over, well, not switching, but incorporating clinical mental health. It's really about that connection. It's really about all three aspects, that competence and that mastery that athletes are looking for inside of the discipline, but it's also inside of that freedom and being a part of the conversation on how they get there, and they will conform even better, and there would be less pushback inside of how they progress. And I'm highly aware of injuries as well. because that's usually the athlete's biggest issue in the setback. Helping them through that and making them more proactive in the process is important.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Whilst you mentioned sport injuries, I'm curious if any of you are aware of any cultural specifics related to sports injury, attitudes from coaches, teammates, and playing hard, and so on.
Can I just jump in there, Kotryna? Because there was, especially about the aspect around coaches. And I think it's, before even thinking about cultural aspects in an injury, I think there's something that needs to be thought of in terms of what are the roles of coaches. Because coaches have a lot of stressors. I mean, there's a lot of work that's gone out, and so that coaches are stressed. And so when it comes to aspects of mental health, even before we start thinking of perhaps even maybe physical injuries, what do we actually want coaches to do with respect to mental health? Do we want them to be perhaps maybe conduits in terms of helping them and guiding them to particular support services? Do they want to be individuals who can be confided in? What is it that we actually want coaches to do? Do we want them to spot particular symptoms? Do we want them just to create a particular atmosphere or team dynamic that is perhaps inclusive and open to discussions around mental health, as well as other elements of health where individuals can go and seek support? Because some of my consulting work, I've seen coaches actually become almost very frustrated that now they have to take on this element of mental health. And especially here in Britain, where coaches are expected to do a lot. There's a lot of safeguarding responsibilities. There's a lot of looking out for radicalization. There is elements of immigration control. And now on top of that, you want me to look after this person's health, in addition to perhaps somehow coaching and steering this team. Coaches have got their hands full. And before we can start thinking about all sorts of other elements, what do we actually want coaches to do? And how best to do that? How best do we perhaps maybe address certain elements of mental health within the repertoire of coaches, in addition to all the things they actually have to do in terms of guiding their teams or their athletes, looking after their staff, all sorts of organizational responsibilities, if it's a youth club, dealing with parents, all sorts of things. I think that when we think of coaches, they are tremendous individuals in sport. And I don't think they get the recognition that they actually need. And before we can think about the athlete's mental health, what about the mental health of coaches themselves? So I think thinking about culture, thinking about coaches, thinking about mental health, I think it's sometimes important to think about what is it that we actually want coaches to do, and how do they actually respond to, say, physical injuries that might be more apparent in certain athletes or teams or particular sports, or just where in this conversation do even coaches come in? Because I've seen everything from this is great to, oh my goodness, this is a burden. So for me, I tread this very lightly when I speak to coaches, and I think about the overall structure and the overall culture of that particular sport and that particular team and what they're actually dealing with.
Yeah, that's a great question to bring it into the discussion, Paul, because I'm reading the book 11 Rings right now, based on Phil Jackson's experiences with the Bulls and later the Lakers. And those are some of the dynamics that he was responding to. And what I noticed inside of the reading is how much he brought in other people to influence the team, whether it's a yoga person or, because coaches really are burdened they want to be able to do what they were trained to do and what they're passionate about, and not deal with the other areas that they're not the emotional aspect of it, but being open and bringing in a sports psychologist and communicating with them, or so it's not just input and output, but it's an input, throughput, output, where they can also have selected influences from the outside and bringing the expertise to. So it's not just a cell that they're, that is impervious, that cannot be penetrated, but it's also a cell that transforms itself. And it's always in a state of renewal and shifting inside of a growth by other people's input, and being okay with that. And I think that would take a lot of pressure off of coaches, because it doesn't affect the leadership and the mastery of their work. I've never had a coach that have issues working with me, because I always want to go where the coaches want to go. Tell me why you brought me in, and okay, so I'll help you get there. So.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm very conscious of time, and we're approaching towards the end of our discussion with morning, evening, afternoon. So let's take our last question for this discussion, and then I'm gonna wrap up. So this last question for today is this: appreciating the difference is key to building trust with athletes and coaches, following up to our current discussion about mental health. What do you recommend as strategies for how you build trust with high-performance athletes and coaches who believe referencing mental health implies they are sick? Would you have any practical advice to share?
I can start. It's very similar to what I said earlier, but it's a matter of the kind of therapeutic relationship, the alliance that you design with the clients that you have, whether it's athletes, whether it's coaches, whether it's staff, whether it's officials, referees. It doesn't matter who you're working with. How are you actually developing an understanding of that client, and how can you best be positioned to help them? I think without establishing that kind of particular therapeutic alliance, which helps individuals feel comfortable and feel open, that they can trust you to disclose certain things, I don't think anything can benefit from a relationship that doesn't have those kinds of elements. So one particular thing is, I would reflect specifically on how you go about building relationships with your clients. What are some of those elements that you do take into consideration when working with someone? How do you get to know them? I think the greater the depth, the greater your ability to actually understand someone and understand what their mental health needs are, and also how you can be best positioned to help either yourself or with appropriate.
Yeah. One of the things that seemed to work for me so far is that I usually, and it doesn't matter if I'm working with a Caribbean team or with the US, I'm very much know that I'm in a sensitive seat when I go in on a team, especially if I don't even know the team and I'm meeting them for the first time. So I usually ask the coaches and the whole medical staff, actually, I talk to them about my role, and it's very transparent, because sometimes athletes can walk up to you and think you're the massage therapist. Like, what do you do? But one of the things that I always ask tentatively, please do not tell an athlete that they need to see a sports psychologist. Come pull me aside, tell me what you're observing, and I will build that relationship with the athlete. Because the message, when you tell an athlete, you need to go see a sports psychologist, it's that alert, alarm. Hey, listen, something is wrong with me. The coach is not, or the medical. So that's just my input inside of this, so that athletes don't feel that our role as sports psychologists is really to solve their problem. We're very performance-based, and you don't need to have a problem in order to have that conversation, because we are in wellness and we are also in prevention. And it's, you feel better. We're the feel-good people.
Thank you, Margaret. So I'm going just to stop here and just trying to wrap everything up. And Paul, I'm going to steal a quote from you, one of your ideas where you ask us to think about our own blind spots. And I hope that this conversation today has helped some people who are attending or listening to us to turn some spotlight on those perhaps blind spots, to really reflect and self-reflect on what we do, how we do, who we work with, and perhaps being more willing to talk about topics we weren't that willing to talk about and ignored up until now. So really trying to push the boundaries, try to push those limits, and try to really better understand how can we become better practitioners, how we can help our clients, our colleagues to achieve their best, and how can we become braver talking about those uncomfortable conversations we absolutely must talk about, because being mute is not going to help. So thank you very much for everyone's time. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the panels for the time. It's been lovely having you, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you, everyone.